Welcome to the Bot Wars Week 4 Challenge tutorial. This week's theme was all about accounts payable. And so we're going to do a tutorial video just like we did with the other sessions where we want to walk through exactly how you can solve this challenge and one way that you might want to build your solution. So let's jump right into it. Now, I want to do this one a little bit different this week because this challenge was a little bit more difficult for people. And so I want to talk about the challenge real quick, and then I want to break down kind of two major solution themes that I can think of, and then we'll build one of those and we'll talk about why we went that way. So first off, if you haven't seen this challenge page yet, we've got the link in the text below, but it's all about invoices, right? We're going to be downloading these invoices from this link right here. We want to process those invoices to extract certain data from them so that we can enter the invoice details down below. So it's going to be like the invoice number, invoice date, invoice total. Those are the pieces of data we need to enter once per invoice. And then there's other data that we have to enter once per row or once per item that shows up on the invoice. And so that will be a variable amount of data. And here we see quantity, description, and total price. We'll have to enter those for as many line items as there are in the invoice. And we'll hit this add item button if we need to add more rows. So that kind of bumps up the challenge difficulty a little bit as well. Finally, after we've entered all of the invoice data, we need to actually upload the image file for that particular invoice. And so we'll have to hit that choose file button, upload an invoice, and then submit the invoice. Okay, so this challenge is a little bit more difficult because of the invoice processing front end that has to happen, but then also because this challenge page is a little bit more difficult. Now, there's two major ways that I can think to solve this challenge using IQBot. Now, I want to talk about both of these approaches, and then we're going to actually build one of them, and I'll talk about why we're going that direction as opposed to the other. But either solution is valid. Both are good ways to build this challenge solution. I just want to talk about both of them, talk about the pros and cons. So the first is using IQBot server-side processing. And this is kind of the traditional way that IQBot has worked since, at least as long as I've known it, since back to like version 10, where you can upload a file to IQBot. IQBot will process that file. Assuming it's a success, you can then download it from IQBot server, and then it comes to you as a CSV with like a 36-character GUID prefixed to the file name, and then you can process it, right? And the way the CSV works is there's like one row per repeating element that you got from, or one row per unique element, I should say, that you get from the CSV. So if I was reading an invoice and it had, let's say, 10 line items, I would have 10 rows in my CSV, and it would be a replication of the data that is unique only per invoice, and then it would be unique data for that different tabular or that different line item kind of data. So the way that this process would work is I would upload all of my invoices to the IQBot server. I would likely loop through all the files in a particular folder to upload them all. I would then want to download all of the processed invoices using the download all documents action that's from the IQBot package. And then I'd loop through my results to actually fill out that integrated invoice processing form and upload the file and things like that. Now, the challenge with this approach is that when the file name comes back to us, it's going to be a 36-character GUID dash file name dash CSV, right? And if I need to upload the actual file to this integrated invoice processing solution, I have to extract what that file name is exactly from that much larger string and then select that actual image file to upload. It's very possible to be done. It just would make our video a lot longer for me to show you that, right? Because we have to go through, we have to loop through uploading all the files. We have to download all the files, but we have to wait till all the files are actually done processing on the server to download them. And then we have to go through the process eventually of using something like a regular expression to extract the file name from that much longer full CSV file name to upload them. So this is definitely a possible approach. It would make our video way, way, way long, right? The other side of this is that when I'm doing IQBot server-side processing, my bandwidth, I would say, of how many files can be processed at a time or how quickly I can process them is really limited to how my IQBot server instance is set up and how my clustering is set up with that, right? And it's a max of 3 cluster nodes, I believe, going off memory. And so I can really only process so many images side by side by side, right? And that could ultimately affect performance if tons of people are doing this at the same time, because we're looking at Community Edition here. So an alternative to that I think is a little bit easier, and one that I like a little bit better for the processing of invoices specifically, is IQBot local device processing. And this is new. I think this was released, I want to say in .20 or .21. Don't quote me on that. It might be a .19 release, but it's new as of this year. And invoices are processed locally. And so what that means is that I use the IQBot local device processing package. I will use that. I will point that particular action to my folder of invoices or folder of files. I will select my learning instance just like I would have done for the server-side processing, and then it will process all the files on that. Now, the alternative here is that all of that processing is happening locally. And so those files would be processed. I would then get a success folder wherever I choose, right? What we're going to see in a little bit here that I get to choose a folder for where I want my outcome to go, or my output. I'll have a success folder there for all of the files that have been successfully processed, and then I can loop through those success files for actually filling out the invoice data on the Integrated Invoicing Solutions web application, right? The difference here is that when I'm doing the local processing, one, I'm not dependent on the IQBot server. So if we're talking about real production, this allows me to have a lot more scalable solution, because however many bot runners I have means however many IQBot processing locations I could have. So that's great because it can scale infinitely to however many bot runners I have. The second side of why I really like this, especially for this tutorial, is that when I'm processing locally, I don't have that 36-character GUID prefixing my file name. It's just the file name itself, .csv. So when it comes time for us to actually select a file for upload, that becomes a lot easier. So we're going to go with this solution for this video because it's going to be a little bit smoother for us to build our bot, and there's kind of fewer gotchas. And we're going to see that this tutorial is pretty long as is. So I want to keep it as simple as possible. And I think this is the cleanest and simplest way to build this solution. Okay, so we're going to divide this video kind of into a couple different sections. The first section here was just talking about our approaches and our intro. The next section, we're going to jump into actually building the learning instance. If you haven't done that before, hang with me on this because I'm going to show you how to do it in Community Edition, but the process is the same if you're doing it in Community Edition or if you're doing it on Enterprise. Okay, so hang with me on that. Once we have that solution built, right? Once we have the learning instance on IQBot built, then we'll go over to actually start building the bot and starting to do our testing, okay? So that's kind of the third component or third piece of this. So if you want to break it up and you already know how to do the learning instance and you're comfortable with that, you can skip ahead. We're going to have some markers here so that you can jump forward and just see the bot building part if you want. But this is going to be kind of a longer video. If you follow along with me the whole time, that's awesome. If you just need to get a part of it, like, hey, I know how to build a bot, I just want to see the IQBot part, that's cool. You can see that part as well. Okay, so let's jump over to building the IQBot solution. Okay, so I'm logged into my Community Edition right now, and you can see I'm on the Explore tab. If you are not using Community Edition, you don't have the Explore tab, right? If you're using Enterprise, you would just go to this home thing, and that's really where you start. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go down to IQBot and then Learning Instances. If, again, you're using Enterprise, this is going to look slightly different for you, right? Because I'm using Community Edition, I see this thing that says, hey, do you want to create a learning instance or do you want to train other documents? For Community Edition, this has kind of been pre-trained for invoices. I'm not going to show you that part because I want to show you how to set up a learning instance from scratch. That way you have something that you could apply to other document types in the future, okay? So I want to show you that part exactly, and that way it'll look exactly like it would look as if you were working on Enterprise. So I'm going to click this button here that says Train Other Documents. Now, you'll notice that it takes me to this URL, which is basically just my control room / IQBot. So if you're working in Enterprise and you have licensing for IQBot, all you need to do to get to the IQBot page is just type in uppercase I, Q, B, and then lowercase OT, IQBot. So you want to fill that in at the end of your URL, and you'll get to this exact page or something very similar to this for actually starting to build out your iQbot learning instances. So I know that was a long explanation. I'm just trying to juggle the differences here between Enterprise and Community Edition. All right, I'm going to click on this Get Started button here. And this is going to allow me to create a new learning instance. And when we think of learning instances in iQbot, we want to think of learning instances as like a collection of different documents where you're all trying to extract the same field types, right? So I would have a learning instances that is invoices, or I would have a learning instance that is utility bills, right? They don't all look exactly the same, right? I'll have invoices coming from different vendors. I'll have utility bills coming from different utility suppliers. But I'm trying to extract the same data from them, right? And that's how we want to think of our different learning instances when we're grouping these together. So for our instance name, I'm going to call this one Accounts Payable Challenge. For description, it's totally optional. I'm just going to say invoice processing for Accounts Payable Challenge. And then you select your document type. And because we're using Community Edition, we see that there's like basically, I don't know, 6 or 7 pre-trained types or pre-trained document types. I'm going to select invoices here. And you'll see when I select that, it's going to give me some common form fields and common tabular data fields to extract. It's because iQbot has basically been pre-trained on these different document types. If I selected something else like utility bills, right, we're going to see that the field names totally change, right? I have account number and billing period and stuff like that. That doesn't mean that I can't use iQbot for other document types. I could select other and do all of this from scratch. Like I could create my own custom relationships between a form label and a form value. But because we're doing invoices, we're just going to select invoices here. Okay, so I've selected invoices. Now, I want to actually upload my documents. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm going to go to the challenge page itself. And let me drag this over here. And I'm going to click on this download invoices button or link here. And it's going to download the invoices for me. Mine's called Sample Invoices 6 because I've obviously downloaded this before. Yours likely is just going to be called Sample Invoices, or if you've downloaded it before, it might be like mine. All right, so I'm going to drag this back over here. I forgot to unzip it. I just clicked it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and extract this one. And we want to take a look at these invoices. And this is the exact same process I would follow if I'm building this for a real production use case, okay? So that's why I'm showing it to you this way, because this is the same, like, hey, follow these steps if you're doing this for your work or if you're just completing this challenge. I have several invoices here, right? I can see this is invoice 1. Invoice 2 looks pretty similar. It's just like different data. Invoice 8 is like a totally different format, but I can see it's mostly got the same stuff. Same with invoice 9. Now, what I want to pay attention to here, though, is that I have the same kind of general data on all of these invoices. Like, what's the data that they have in common? Well, they all have an invoice number. They all have an invoice date. They all have an invoice total. And then they've got some line item stuff, right? And for the different line items, we have a quantity, we have a description, we have an amount. We also have some other data. And you'll notice that, like, this one has a purchase order. This one also has a purchase order. I think one of them doesn't have. Okay, it looks like they all have purchase orders. But it's very possible that I might have some data that shows up on some invoices and doesn't show up on others. That's totally fine too, right? I can still set that up with my learning instance. I can set that as optional data. But I want to make sure that the data that I'm looking for is going to be consistent across these. And if it's not, I just need to know I need to set those up as optional fields. So we also see that I have like variable amounts of data. Here I have 3 line items. Here I have 2, 3 line items, 3. Here I have 4. So we want to make sure we can capture all of that data. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a couple of these images and I'm going to upload them so that when we're actually training our learning instance, it has some images to go off of. And what we're going to see happen is that iQbot will actually create groupings of these where it identifies images and data that are similar enough to be considered a grouping, right? They're similar enough that they've got the same data, they've got the same kind of taggings, and it doesn't need to be split up into multiple groups. So Let's go back to our IQbot page here. I'm going to hit Browse for the Upload Documents. And I'm at my sample invoices folder that we were just looking at. I'm going to grab, let's say 2, there's 7 total, right? How many are there? I think there's 7. Yeah, there's 7. All right, so I'm going to grab 2, 3. I know that 8 is different. I know that 9 is different. Let's do 2, 3, 8, and 9. So I'm going to hit Open there. All right, so I've got 4 files that I've uploaded. That's fine. Now, when we think about the fields we need to extract, that's really going to be driven in our case by the data we need to fill here. So I need to fill invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total. And that's the once per invoice kind of data. So let's go back here. Invoice date is already checked. Invoice number is already checked. Invoice total is already checked. If there was other stuff I needed to add, I could come down here and do that, right? I could go check the box. Or if there was custom fields I needed to add, right? That, hey, I need to extract this one piece of data, but I don't see it tagged here already. So I'm just going to create my own custom one. I can do that. So we're good on that once per invoice kind of data. The per line item we need to have is a quantity description and total price. So let's go back over here. I have an item description showing up. I have an item total, and I have a quantity. And if I scroll down here, there are other item values I could add. If I needed an item number or an item name or some other tax value, I could do that. We can really just leave these as is out of box, and we don't have to touch anything. Finally, I'll show you the other configurations here. If I wanted to change the OCR engine that I'm using for my extraction, I could do that. I'm just going to leave this part alone because Abby's going to work fine for what we're doing. But if you were getting results you didn't think were optimal and you wanted to try out a different OCR engine to see how that impacted your results, you're welcome to do that. We also have the ability to do auto checkbox detection. Now, for our particular invoices, we don't really have any boxes that need to be checked. There was nothing on our images that are checkboxes that I saw, but you do have the ability to do that if you wanted to, right? So if you're doing like a custom form and there was a binary decision of like a yes, no, or check here if you confirm, you could include that checkbox detection and you could check for those as well. So I'm gonna hit this create instance and analyze. And at this point, the images that I submitted are gonna be uploaded to the IQbot server. IQbot server is going to analyze those to identify classifiers and see where it should identify groupings, right? So I submitted 4 documents. I could have to have up to 4 different groupings here, or it may say, hey, those images are similar enough. We have enough similarities. I'll just do one grouping, and that will be enough for you to extract the data that you need. So I can see here that it's selected invoice 2 as the key image. And if I look through this, I can actually see that it did an excellent job of extracting the data I need without me having to do anything at all, right? Invoice date, it found the label, it also found the data. Invoice number, same thing, it found the label, it found the data. So you'll probably find, and this is true for our training images here, but also for real images that you might use for production, that it does a really good job of finding those relationships between a field label and the field data. And it's trained to look for those certain keywords for the field label. It's also trained to look in certain directions for the actual matching data. So, some forms might have it where invoice number is on the left and then the actual number itself is on the right. I know that's backwards because you're looking at my screen, so it'll be like left and right. But it's trained for those kind of relationships as well as this like above and below kind of thing. And then you can also customize these further if you need to. So if the label was actually a little bit further away or there was another anchor that made more sense, you could do that. So I can see here that it's done a good job of extracting that once per form kind of data. It looks like it's all correct. It's found those relationships properly. If I look at the table repeated sections here, I'm going to click on this very first one that says table section settings. And what it's doing here is this is kind of like the core table setting itself, and this isn't specific to any particular field, but the table as a whole. And it's saying, hey, what's the best field for identifying that this is a repeated section? And so I can choose from either item description, item total, or quantity, which were the 3 items that I said I wanted to extract. And it's saying, what's the element that determines that this is a new line? And I'm going to say quantity here, right? Because every time that I see quantity on this table, I know that it's a new line. And if you think about description, right? Sometimes you've seen these invoices where description will go into like 2 or 3 lines. That's probably not a good one to determine that this is a repeated section, because I don't want a new line item every time I have a new line for description. But every time I see quantity, that's me signifying that, hey, this is a new line item on my invoice. So that's what we're saying when we select quantity here. We also have the ability to set an end of table indicator. And this is me saying, hey, if you get to this, you know that the table's over. So stop trying to do that line item stuff. And what I'm going to select here is this word subtotal, right? Because what we see is that, okay, once I've gone through all of these line items and I get to subtotal, I know that my table is over. So I don't want to keep extracting more data at that point because I've got the whole table, right? Don't keep going and don't get confused with like trying to grab extra data or other random stuff that might be over here. If I look at my tabular data itself, I can see that it's found header values here, and it's going to try to match those with the line items below it. Now, one thing I want to do here is see it found description, but it found it like kind of in the middle. I want to extend out description to kind of give it some guidance as to where description is actually found, right? Because description could be this entire width. So I want to give it plenty of space here so that it knows that, hey, like description is actually this wide. And as you're going through and extracting those column values, or those row values, I should say, you want to read this whole thing. I don't want to just read like whatever is this first column here. Because there's a dash here, it's kind of weird. So I want to make sure that I'm still reading the word bracket plus the dash plus the widget type A. I'm going to do the same thing for item total, which is over here, which is my amount. We'll do that. I'm going to extend this out in case we have an item amount that's super expensive. And then the same thing with quantity. I really don't have to address this one very much because there's not a lot of mixed data down there. But I'll extend that one a little bit too. Okay? Now, I've got this set up, but I want to see how it actually works. So if I go to see extraction results, I'm going to see an example of exactly how it did with extracting the data from this particular sample image. And here is where I can kind of test out the accuracy of my learning instance and see like, hey, is this working like I expected, or do I need to go back and possibly tweak some things? So let's see how it does here. It's currently processing this server side and will give me those results. I can see that it got my invoice date. If I click on it, it's going to show me exactly where it found all of that data, highlighting it in yellow over here. And then for my line items, it found bracket widget A, bracket widget type C, bracket widget type B. It's got my item totals correct. It also has my quantities correct. If I go up here to the top, right, remember we submitted 4 documents? I can click the forward arrow and it's going to do the same extraction except with whatever the next image was that I had uploaded. So this was the invoice 3 TIFF. Again, I want to come through here, make sure that it extracted all of the data correctly, make sure I don't see any weird issues with like cutting off data or things like that. All of this looks like it's correct. Let's click the forward arrow one more time. This should be a slightly different format, I think, because I think we selected 1, 3, yeah, so here we go. This is a different format, but it's still an invoice. So here, it's got the date, it's got the invoice number, it's got the total. If we come down here and look at the items, it's still got all my descriptions correct. It's still got my item totals and my quantities. We'll do one last one, which is I think invoice 9 maybe. Yeah, there's invoice 9. So again, it found all of that data, even though it's a slightly different format, even though some of these labels are not the exact same, it was able to find all the data that we needed. We see that it's doing a full extraction of all that data. We got our descriptions right, quantities are right, stuff like that. So I'm going to close that. You could export it to a CSV if you wanted to do further analysis. I'm going to close out of that. And I'm going to go to save and go to next group. Now, if we had multiple groups that were identified by IQBot, at this point we'd have to do that same process for that next group. And maybe the labels are a little bit different, or the relationships between data and label are a little bit different. So we might have to tweak those. And that's where it would identify differences in those groups. But if I hit save here, it's going to say, hey, there's no other groups in this queue. So there's nothing else left for us to train. It identified that the images that we submitted were close enough that it doesn't need to have a separate group here. So it's going to take us back to our learning instance. And our learning instance is called Accounts Payable Challenge. That's what we called it before. and it has one group within it, and that one group was auto-named to group underscore 38915. From here, what we want to do, if I needed to go back and edit this, I could. I'm going to click this set to production, and it's going to say, hey, when you send this to production, it's going to start to be able to process real live documents, and you'll be able to select it from the bot building side, right? So when we're actually configuring a bot and we're on that automation tab and setting that up, this will now show up as a valid learning instance that we can select from. So I'm going to hit yes, send to production. At this point, it's in production. It's going to start keeping track of some stats for us as far as like how often we're getting straight through processing, how often stuff is going to failure, stuff like that. There's some cool reporting you can see on it, but for us right now, this is all we need to do to set up our learning instance. So that's the end of this particular section. In the next section, we're going to jump into actually building the bot, and that's where we're going to make use of the learning instance that we just set up. Okay, so we're back into the Automation Anywhere control room. I'm going to click on this automation tab here because I want to create a new bot. And so it's going to load up all of my folders. I'm going to go to Bot Wars. I'm going to delete this one because I'm going to recreate it here. You probably don't have an accounts payable one. So I'm going to click this Create Bot. I'm going to name it, let's call it Accounts Payable Challenge, and hit Create and Edit. Now, we want to think back to the challenge page itself as we start to build this out, because just like we did with the other solution tutorials, if you watch any of those, the way that I always start building a bot is I start with the step action, right? And I go through and kind of build out the skeleton of what I want that bot to look like, and then I work backwards to kind of fill in the actual real logic for completing those different steps. So our first step here is going to be process invoices. Okay, and what we're going to do there is the IQBot local processing. So we're going to use that learning instance that we just set up in the last section of the video, and we will process all of our invoices and make sure that we can get our exported data so that we're actually able to start filling out these forms. The next step we're going to add is to launch the challenge page. So that will start our timer, right? Because the timer starts when we actually launch the page. So we'll launch that challenge page. And again, we said in the rules that if you want to pre-process the invoices, that's totally fine. I'm cool with that. This challenge is not about like testing how good your laptop is or how good your desktop is. It's really about being able to accurately fill in the form data and accurately extract it. So pre-process your invoices, that's fine. I don't mind on that. All right, so we've launched the challenge page. At this point, we need to fill out the invoice details. So let's go through and say we want to loop through invoice. Let's say loop through invoices data, because this is where we're going to basically do a loop where we're looping through all of the exported data from our IQBot processing, right? So we're going to have one CSV file per invoice, and we're going to loop through all of those to fill out the data on this form. Now, when we're looping through it, there's actually what I'll call, let's say, 4 steps here. Okay. The first one is going to be filling out the once per invoice data, right? And that's going to be our invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total. I'm just looking at my challenge page over here so I can tell you guys what that is. The next step is going to be filling out our, what is it? Tabular data? Nope, that's definitely not spelled right. Tabular. Yeah, that's close enough. All right, and then the next one is going to be our uploading the file. And then the last one is going to be the submit. And then finally, outside of that, we'll add a cleanup step. I don't know if we're going to do much cleanup for this one or not, but I'll add it here. I always like to have a cleanup step at the end of my bots, even if I have like, I know that these are kind of just challenge bots and we don't have error handling and stuff like that. But in the case of like a real production bot, when I've got error handling and stuff like that, this cleanup will usually live inside of the finally block for my error handling. So I do it no matter what. It's just we don't have a ton of error handling here. All right. So when we're looping through our invoices, right, we want to read the invoice. Oh, let's add another step. We need to read invoice data. That was one that we missed. Okay, so we want to read the invoice data. We want to fill out that once per invoice data, which is the top 3 fields. We want to fill out the tabular data, which is those the line items, right? And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because if my invoice only has 1 line item, then I'm good. If it has like 4, then I need to make sure I've clicked the add item button 3 times. I don't need to click it 4 times because there's already one that's there. So just keep that in mind. And then my upload file part, I need to click that button here where I click choose file. And we're gonna have to go through the process of actually selecting the file here, making sure we get the right one that matches the data, and then finally submitting. Okay, so let's go back through and start to fill in some of our skeleton of code now. I'm going to put up dual mode here just so you can see it both ways, because I know some people build in list view, some people build in flow view. This way you can see it both ways, and because we're going to have kind of a lot of code here, it'll be good to be able to kind of break it up and minimize things as we need to. So for processing invoices, what we're going to do is I'm going to go to the IQ bot. And we can see there's a couple IQbot packages here. And again, because I'm in Community Edition, I have 4 total. If you're using Enterprise, you may not have all 4 of these. It depends on what's been installed. But I'm going to go to this IQbot local device, and then I'm going to drag over the process invoices. And if you are using Enterprise, I know that previously this was a separate download. It's still included with IQbot, but it is a separate download. So make sure that you download this if it's not installed already. So that you can do that local document processing. All right, when I'm setting this up, I will have to choose a learning instance. So I'll select from my dropdown the Accounts Payable challenge, which is the one that we just set up, right? That was the learning instance that we just set up. It asks for an input documents folder. So let's grab the folder that I was just using, which is sample invoices 6. I'm going to give it that path. So there's the path. That's the path that all my files live in. I don't have to give it a specific file. I give it a folder. It's going to grab all of the images inside of that folder. I don't have to worry about the looping myself. For the output path, I'm going to give the exact same path, which is going to be our sample invoices 6 for me. Yours might be slightly different. What it's going to do is it's automatically going to create a success subdirectory in here for me for all of the successfully processed invoices. If I had some that had failed, like the not processed, I would get a separate folder for that as well. But ours should all successfully process because these are relatively clean images. I also have the option to send documents to the IQbot validator for validation. This is super helpful if you're considering a real production situation. I might need to send those invoices to the IQbot validator. That's where a human can come in and perfect or fix the results of the extraction from IQbot. That might be identifying that like, hey, this actually isn't an invoice and it shouldn't have come in this way, and so we had a bad file. Or it might be that we have a new invoice type that our existing learning instance isn't set up to handle, and we might need to create a new group for it. So there's lots of exceptions and lots of areas where, hey, this is kind of a weird one-off, we didn't get it. Maybe this needs to be brought up to the bot builder who originally built this to add it as a new group to the learning instance. Maybe it's an issue of classification where we need to identify that this image doesn't belong here in the first place and figure out why this was sent to the learning instance because, hey, someone sent it to the wrong email or something like that. All right, so I'm going to leave that checked. It's really probably not going to matter for this particular example. Now, before we get too far down the path of setting up the rest of this stuff, I want to run this step, right? Our bot's pretty empty right now, except for this one thing. I'm just going to run it. Now, if you're doing the IQbot local processing like I am, you'll see that the very first time that you do this, it's going to take way longer than it normally does. And that's because the very first time you do it, it's going to download the entire package that's needed to execute this locally, okay? And this package is a little bit larger than the rest. So whenever you're running a bot, either on a bot runner or in our case in development mode, what happens is the packages that basically power this entire bot are downloaded locally to a global cache folder. And those packages are just jar files. And what's happening is that jar file needs to be downloaded locally so that it can execute and actually do whatever the thing is that this action is. So in this case, it's processing our invoices, doing that OCR, extracting out the invoice details that we had set up in our learning instance. So if I move my folder over here, we should see here in a second that we're going to start to see a success folder show up, and we should see that we start to have invoice data that is showing up here. So there's my success folder, and it's going to start to process those. Now again, if yours is taking a lot longer to actually download that package, that only happens for the very first time. Once you've already done it, it won't take quite as long. But feel free to pause the video at this point if you want yours to be able to finish that download so that you can hang with me for this next part. I'll open up this success folder. We'll see how we're doing here. So we've got, I think, is that all 7 of them? Yeah, so our bot just finished and we've got all 7. Cool. Now I'm going to open up one of these. I'm going to open up invoice 2 because that was one that we looked at earlier. First, I want to make sure that it looks like it got all of the data correct. Secondly, I want to keep this open so that as we start to think about reading from this CSV file, we know exactly what data we're going to be looking for and how it's formatted. So let me expand all my columns here so I can read all of this. Okay, so remember at the beginning of the video, I said that certain data would be repeated for every single line. And that's because that data is not unique multiple times per the invoice. It's only unique once per invoice. So the invoice date, invoice number, and invoice total, we see that those repeat. And then my unique line items here for my item description, my item total, and quantity, those are all unique per row. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind as we're reading our data, but also as we're starting to fill out our form. This is kind of the format of how this is going to work. So I'm going to keep that open. I'm just going to move it over here for right now. But I wanted to just validate that it looks like we're getting the read successfully. It looks like we got our results. Those look clean to me. Our next step, so we can minimize this one. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this right here because I don't need this to run again, right? We've already processed our invoices once. I've got that data locally. You know, that kind of took a little bit longer. I don't want to keep making you suffer through that while you're watching a tutorial. So I'm going to disable that part, and that way we won't have to do that again. We already have all of our data local, so we'll just go from there. I want to launch the challenge page. So let's go to my browser and open. And I will give the URL for that. And let's go to Google Chrome. The URL for that challenge page is right here. I have it open over here. I'm just copying it down. And then we'll fill it in as the link to open and hit save. Okay, so that part's done. That was the easy one. Then we want to go through and start looping through our invoice data. Now, we said loop here, but that doesn't actually build a loop. We have to actually put a loop action in here. So what I'm going to do is go down to the loop package, and I will drag the loop action over right there. And I will choose my iterator. Now, when I choose my iterator, it's basically saying, what do I want this loop to consist of, right? What's going to determine how many times I'm going through whatever loop it is. And for us, that's going to be file in folder. So I'm going to go down here for file in folder. I will give a folder path. I want to go out to my success directory that we were just looking at, right? So for me, it's my name, downloads, my sample invoices folder /success. I'm going to copy that. And I will fill that into the folder path. Now, every time it iterates over one of those files, it's going to give me something as an iterator. And for our case, that's going to be the file name and the file extension. I can either have those as a dictionary, which is a key value pair, or I can have them as multiple unique values. I'm going to select multiple values here because I want to have a unique value for my file name. I want to have a unique value for my extension. I probably wouldn't do it this way if I had like 15 values that were coming back to me, but because it's only 2, I'll just do it like this. So I'm going to add variable mapping, And note the note here, right? It says access the name key to access the file name, access the extension key to access the file extension. So for my key, I'm going to put in the word name. And then for my variable, I'm going to select to create a new one. And I'm going to call this one sFileName and hit create and select. And then hit add. And I'll do the same thing for my extension. So my key here, again, going back to this note, is extension. And my value, I'm going to create a new one, is going to be called sFileExtension. And then hit create and select. Cool. So I have both of those. So that means as I'm going through my loop, I can reference that file name and that extension if I need to. We're going to see those come up here in a little bit. All right, so let me save that. My loop is now defined. I want to put all of my steps here, right? My read invoice data all the way to my submit invoice. I'm going to drag those inside of my loop, okay? Because I want each of those to happen once per file. So the first thing we need to do is read my invoice data. So we're going to do that with a CSV TXT action. First, we're going to open the file. And it's going to say, what file do you want to open? We will provide a path. Actually, I think it's on my clipboard right here. Yep. So it's my success folder. Let me drag this over a little bit so you can see it. It's my success directory. I'm going to put a backslash, and then I'm going to reference that same variable that we just set up, which is my file name. Oops, sorry, file name. And then my, I can put a dot. And then all of mine are technically CSV, so I could hard code this, but since we have the variable, we'll put it in there. s.fileExtension. Cool, so we've got that. So it's my path to the CSV files. Make sure it's the path to the CSV, not to the images, /filename.extension. Now, does my data contain a header? If I look at one of my CSVs, yes, indeed it does. This is important because as we're doing our looping through this file, I don't want to consider this for one of the iterations of my loop because it's only header data. It also allows me to reference the data in these different columns by header name instead of just index. So I'll show you that here in a second. So definitely check this box. It says contains header. It is comma separated. It is a CSV, not a TSV, so we want to leave that. And then we'll hit save. All right, the file has been opened, but I need to actually read it. So now I'm going to drag in a read action right after that. And I can assign the value to a variable. At this point, I'm going to create a new variable. And notice that the type is actually a table or a data table. So I'm going to call this one TBL, and let's say current invoice. TBL current invoice. And what that data table is going to consist of is everything that I'm seeing here in this spreadsheet. Every column and every row. Finally, I will close my CSV, right? I don't need to keep it open. I open it up, I read from it to a data table, and then I'm going to close it back up. So I have my invoice data to a variable. At this point, I'm good to go to start filling out some of that invoice data onto the actual form. So my once per invoice data, I'm going to launch my page here. I'm going to maximize this because we're going to do some recording here in a second. And actually, I'm going to reload this because I want to make sure we're working off a totally clean version. All right, let's go back here. So my once per invoice data, again, some of you are using the web automation package. That's totally fine. You're welcome to do that. I'm going to do this with the built-in recorder capture action. But if you're using web automation, it's a very similar process, and I'm sure you're familiar with how to do that. I'm going to select my window here, which is my invoice entry lab title there. And I'm going to click capture object. The first one I'm going to fill in is my invoice number. So let me mouse over that. See, it's got a red box on it. Once I see that red box, I'm going to click. I should be good to go. At that point, Automation Anywhere is going to capture everything that it knows about that particular object. So if we scroll down here, we can see that it's got the DOMX path, the HTML tag, a path value. I can also choose my action to take on the object. Now for us, we want to set the text. So I'm going to select set text, and then it's going to ask me what keystrokes do you want to enter? So what do I want to enter that to? And if we come back to what we had for our CSV, that first field was our invoice number. So I'm going to look at this and I'm going to actually grab the header value here, which is invoice_number. I'll come back here and I'm going to press F2. And that's going to bring up my Variables Explorer. Here I can select a value and I'm going to select TBL current invoice. Now, because we're selecting to reference a value from a table outside of looping through that table, I can choose the row that the data should come from. I can also choose the table column. Now, I'm going to put the table column as, oh, there we go, invoice_number. I pasted that in from what I just copied on our spreadsheet over here. Oh shoot, I wiggled that around and then it minimized everything. So I'm going to copy it from there. And that will allow me to extract that data from what is my first row, which is right here, right? My first real data row of my data table. Remember, this is a header, so it's not considering that as a valid row. This is my first real row of data. I'll hit yes, insert, and I will hit save. Now, what I'm going to do is actually copy this step, and I'm going to paste it, because I'm going to do a very similar thing for my next action. I'm going to hit recapture object. I'm going to highlight over the invoice date and click. And then I'm going to set the text. Now, it's already got this in here with invoice number. What I'm going to do is, I'm sorry, this was the, I'll have to look back at what field that we did. Invoice date. So with invoice date, I want to find that column. It's actually the first one here. I can copy this value. And what I'm going to do, instead of going through that Variables Explorer again, I'm just going to paste this in here. And as long as I do it inside of those double quotes, I should be good. Cool. Set text is still there. Obviously, it updated all the details for the DOM-X path and things like that for my invoice date. So I'm good on that. I'm going to copy this step one more time. And this will be the last one that I need to do once per invoice. So I'm going to hit recapture object. This will be for my invoice total. I'll click right there. And once again, it's set text. I just need to update this for my invoice total. So let me come back to my spreadsheet right here, copy my header for invoice total, and fill that in right here. Okay, just make sure you keep it inside of those double quotes and the curly brackets so that the formatting is correct. All right, so we're done with the once per invoice data. Now I want to do the tabular data. And this is where it gets a little bit more confusing. Now let's think through this process before we start adding any code. What I'm thinking of here is that for the very first row, I don't need to click any buttons, right? I just need to enter my data. For every row after that first row, I need to click this button that says add item, okay? So the way that I think to do that is, A, we need to loop through the CSV itself, or my data table actually. But B, I need some way to keep track of what row that I'm on so that I know if I need to click that add item button or not. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new variable, and it's going to be of type number, and I'm going to call it invoice table row, and I'll hit create. And the very first thing I'm going to do inside of our tabular data step here is set that number value. I'm going to do assign, and I'm going to set that to a 1. I'm hard coding it to a 1 because every time we process a new invoice, I need to make sure that this value is set back to a 1 because that's going to be my very first row of processing. So after I've set that, now I need to loop through my data table. So I'm going to add another loop here. And how many times do I want to loop? I want to loop through the data table. So once per data row in my data table. And I'll choose a data table here, which is TBL current invoice. And then I'm going to go and actually choose a record variable that I want to set this to. So I'm going to click the create variable here. I can give my record a name. Again, think of a record as just like a row from my data table or a row from my spreadsheet. I'm going to call this one our current invoice row and hit create and select. I'll take a drink real quick. All right, so with that set up, notice that the data that I'm going to have for every iteration of my loop is that record, is that data. I won't have a number. So we're going to have to make sure that we manually increment this invoice table row number ourselves. So inside of each one of these rows, what I need to do is first I want to check to see if this is the first row or not. So I'm going to add a conditional statement. And my condition is going to be around a number because I'm checking for that invoice table row value. And I'm going to say number condition. And if invoice table row is greater than 1, what action do I need to take? I need to click the button to add a new row. So really this logic is only going to apply for those invoices that have more than one row. And it's only going to apply to those second, third, fourth, fifth rows, whatever it is. So scrolling down here, I'm going to add a capture step inside of that. I will select the previously selected invoice entry tab and then click capture object. At this point, I will highlight over the add item. And my action is just going to be to perform a click. Okay. If this doesn't make sense to you right away, just hang with me and follow that, and you'll see as we start to run that you can kind of understand why that came in. It's really about thinking ahead of what's going to cause me problems in the future, right? Like if I just keep adding rows every single time, then I'm going to end up with an extra row. And while the validation for this particular lab may not catch you on that, it's really not the best way to do it, okay? This would be the best way to do it where I'm not adding those extra data rows unless I really need them. So just trust me on that one for right now. If you're kind of lost on that logic, hopefully you're able to follow along. All right, so still, what do we need to do? Whether or not I've clicked this button or not, I need to fill out the data for every single one of those rows, right? The quantity, the description, and the total. So I'm going to add a recorder step, and actually I'll just copy this one. I'll paste it, but I'm going to put it outside of that conditional statement, right there. And if we click on this one so that we can start to set it up, I'm going to click recapture object, and I'm going to highlight over this quantity here and click. Now what I'm going to do is I want to take a screenshot of the object properties here. And I'll show you why I'm doing that here in just a second. Because what I'm doing is I want to have something to compare to see if I can identify if there's some kind of pattern here for the way that I can do my kind of dynamic entry of data. So there's my image. I'm going to drag it over here for just a second. And what I'm going to do is come back to my challenge page. I'm going to click the add item. And then I'm going to do the same capture thing, but I'm going to do it on this second row of quantity. So let's go back here. I'm just going to hit recapture object. I will highlight over row 2 of quantity. And then let's drag this out just a little bit so we can actually read some of these. I'll bring this guy back over so we can see it kind of side by side. Hopefully you can see those. Let me scroll up. I can't scroll up anymore. Hopefully you can kind of see those side by side. I know my face is in the way a little bit, but notice that between the first row and the second row, my path is different. So I'm going to just totally not include that as an object property. My HTML ID is different, right? But I see it's incrementing. So I think there's a pattern there that we can use. And I don't have it right here. You can't see it from the original path, but my actual DOMX path is different as well because this is the second input with the name of invoice quantity. I don't want to include this DOMX path because I don't want to accidentally write over what was in row 1. So I'm going to exclude the DOMX path. I will include the HTML ID. I'll include some of this other stuff like the HTML name because that isn't terribly specific to a particular one. but I'm going to uncheck the path and the DOMX path. And that will allow me to build a solution here that's going to be dynamic for no matter how many rows of data I need to add on this application interface. So what we'll do here is I'll click this drop down for the object properties. I'm going to uncheck the box next to DOMX path. I'm going to uncheck the box next to path. And then for my HTML ID, I'm actually going to delete this number 2 here. And I'm going to type in a number manually. Now I'm going to do $, and then what do we call it? In invoice table row, I'm going to type a dot, and we'll see that the IntelliSense comes up with a inline conversion that I can do to a string, which is number colon to string. So I'm going to click that. And we'll see that it's going to finally accept that as a valid variable here. I'm going to highlight over that one. Let me extend it here so you can see the whole thing. I'm going to copy this variable because we're going to use this in the next couple clones that we're doing. I'm going to copy that right there. Okay. But it's basically saying, okay, look for the HTML ID with quantity underscore row underscore and then whatever the number is. And that's because of the way that the HTML was done on this particular application that we're using or this particular page. This won't be the exact same process for every application you use, but it's important to kind of understand these patterns and the things that I'm looking for as I go through and try to make my bots as dynamic as possible. Now, for my action to take here, I'm actually going to fill in text. So I'm going to hit set text. And I can enter keystrokes. So let's hit F2 here. I'm going to select TBL. Oh no, I want to do current row, sorry. So our current invoice row. And here I don't select a row because it already knows that I'm in a loop. So I have a particular record, right? This is the record, this is not a data table. So I'm talking about a particular record, which is equivalent to one single row. And I can give either an index or a name. If I'm going to give an index, it is 0 based. So this would be 0, 1, 2, 3 for my description. But because this is the quantity, I'm going to grab the quantity header here. I'll hit copy. And I'll put that in as the name that I'm looking for the header row, or for the column, I should say. All right, so we're good there. Let's hit save. Hopefully you're able to follow along with me. I know that was a little bit complex of a setup. We're going to copy that same action and paste it because we're going to do pretty much the same thing 2 more times because we have to do the description and the total. So here's my description. I'll click on that one. Set text. This one is going to be current row, but instead of quantity, it's going to be, what field was this? Description. So I'm going to copy this out of the CSV. It's actually item underscore description. And then for my object properties, I'm going to, like we did before, uncheck the box for DOMX path, uncheck the box for path, and for my HTML ID, I'm going to delete that number 1. For me, I hit the Windows key and V, and it allows you to look at your clipboard history. And I had saved out my clipboard history with that invoice row number colon to string, which is the number value for whatever row that I'm on. So I'm going to reference that, and I'll just move that back over here. So again, if you didn't have it on your clipboard, you could do it the same way that we did before, where you just go out and type in that value. But because I had it on my clipboard, I'm going to reference that. Let me minimize my object properties and save. We need to do that one more time. That was for the description. I think we still need to do whatever is that third column. So let's copy, paste that one more time. Let's click on it so we can bring up the properties. I'm going to hit capture object. Oh, total price. We're going to do that one. Cool. So total price, set text is my action. Let me grab, so over here, back on my CSV, item total is my total price. So I'm going to copy the item total. In my current row here, I'm going to fill this in as item total. That's fine. And then I'm going to go back to do the same thing with my object properties that we did before. I'm going to uncheck the HTML or the DOM-X path. I could keep the DOM-X path and just keep iterating this value right here for the row, but I'm just doing it for the HTML ID because that's going to be the cleanest, I think. Again, I'll paste in my invoice table row.number : to string, which is going to be the specific row that we're on. And I'm going to uncheck that path, and I think we're good. Now, if you're watching this and saying, well, where does that row number thing come from, and how do we make sure that gets incremented? We have to actually increment that one manually, because remember, our iterator for this loop is actually the record. It's not a number. So what I'm going to do here is, after we've filled out that entire row worth of data, I need to make sure that I have a number increment action here. And it's going to say, what number do you want to increment? I'm going to select my invoice table row. I'm going to increment it by 1, and then I'm going to assign it back to my invoice table row. And that way, the very first time through, it's going to fill that form out normally, right? And it's not going to click that add row button. The next time through, my row number is going to be greater than 1 at that point, so it will click that add row button. And then it's going to go ahead and add that data to whatever is the newest row that just got added, and then it'll increment my number again. Okay? So we're good on the tabular data. We're on to the upload file part. So let's go back to our form here. I'm going to refresh this, get rid of our extra rows here. And this is what we're going to be looking at, right? We want the bot to click this button, and then we want the bot to actually select the file that we want to upload. So I'm going to hit cancel, and let's go back to using our recorder. For upload file, I'm going to go to my recorder capture. I'm going to select browser, select my Automation Anywhere lab, and then I'll click capture object. I'm going to highlight over this choose file button. Now notice that I can't just select the button, it's selecting like that entire area. Now, having done this for practice some, right, just to see how that button interacts with things, I was having trouble that it wasn't working all the time on the click action, because sometimes it was just highlighting that object, it wasn't actually clicking on it. So what I'm going to do is actually select left click here. And the difference is, when I select click, it's trying to execute the JavaScript action on that particular object. When I select left click, it's actually trying to put my cursor, right, I'm doing the cursor hand thing, right over the button and actually execute a click from my mouse. And in certain situations, you'll see that that works more reliably. The downside of that is that my the page, I'd have to actually like scroll down here and then hit that button, right? So it is a little bit weird that I can't control my mouse at all if I'm gonna have a left click in there, because I could interrupt the actual bot run. So I'm gonna use left click here. And it's gonna click that button, that's totally fine. What I'm gonna do now is actually click the button manually, because I want this open dialog to show up, the select file. And notice that the application here is called open. I'm gonna switch back over to Automation Anywhere, and I'm going to do another capture step. And this time it's going to have to be an application. So I'm going to hit refresh Windows, and it's going to basically come back with every application I have open. And I'm going to select this open right here. And if I click capture object, it's going to allow me to highlight objects over here. The easiest way that I found to do this is to put my cursor into file name and hit click. And what I want to do is I want to fill out the full path to that file, the file in question, right? Whatever one I'm processing, and then hit enter. And that way it's going to automatically accept it. I don't have to worry about like navigating to a specific directory and having it click a file or anything like that, or even click the open button. I'm going to have it type in the full path to the file and then hit enter. So here what I'm going to do is hit set text. And for the keystrokes, I'm going to put my base file path, which is not going to be the file path to my success directory. It's going to be the file path to my invoices, because we need to upload the actual invoice image. We don't want to upload the invoice CSV. That's not what the lab calls for. So I'm going to put that base file path, right, which is basically my images directory. I'll do slash, and then I'm going to press F2. And if you remember back to what we did in this entire parent loop, was that I've got my S file name. And if you remember what S file name is going to look like, let's go back to our success directory. S file name is going to be everything but the extension for this file. So technically S file name for file 1 is going to be invoice1.tiff. The extension is CSV. Remember, the extension is stored in a separate value. The file name itself, though, is just invoice1.tiff. So what we do is we're actually good here, right? That's the full file name. It's going to be invoice1.tiff within this sample invoices directory 6. And then at the very end of this path, and I'll move this over so you can see the whole thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click this insert keystroke, and I'm going to put in the word enter here, right? Or not the word enter, but I'm going to select enter from this virtual keyboard. And that will allow me to, and I click this little icon right here that says insert keystroke, that will allow it to automatically submit the path that I've selected. So we can validate that real quick by copying one of these files. So let's go to here. I'm going to say copy path. I'm going to launch Notepad real quick. Because when you copy path, it's automatically going to have open and close parentheses. We don't want that for this because that's not what our bot's going to have. So now I'm going to copy this path. Go back to my challenge page. Here I have that open file thing. I'm going to put in the full file path and then press enter. And we notice that that's actually going to accept the file. That's going to take it because it's a valid file path pointing to a valid file. So that's all we need to do for that one. All right, the last one we need to do is actually submitting. So let's hit save on this one. Minimize the upload file. The last thing we need to do is submit the invoice. And again, submit the invoice still needs to be inside of our loop that happens per file or per invoice. So I'm going to add a capture step here. We need 2 of those. We're going to need the first capture step to go and click the yes accept terms radio button. So right here, I'm going to select that guy. And then we'll switch back. You know, one thing I'll point out here is that, oops, let's go back here. What did that say? Oh, it does not match the window. Maybe I selected the wrong window. Let's try that one more time. Hit yes. Automation Anywhere Labs, invoice entry. Let's say capture object. Click the radio button there. There we go. One thing I'll point out here is that, you know, I know this is a long tutorial and it's a lot to take in, but what I would say is that this is a great way to learn, especially if you're new to Automation Anywhere. This is a great way to learn how to think about processes, right? I'm kind of showing you when I do these steps and when we go through and build this out, like exactly how I'm thinking through the problem. And so I would encourage you not only to just follow along like mindlessly on what I'm doing on the screen, but also pay attention to the way that I'm thinking through these problems, because that's something that you can take away and apply to other problems or other challenges that you come up with. So for our action here, I'm going to select click would work too, but I'm going to select that radio button. And then I'll copy this action, paste it one more time, and that will be for us to click the submit button. So at the very bottom, we'll click submit, and then I think we're ready to test. All right, my action to take on that button is to click, I'll hit save, and I think we're ready to test our bot. So to test, let's close this window here, right? I don't need to have the exercise page open, and if I do, it might actually cause problems, so I don't want to do that. Again, I have my process invoices action, or entire step plus the action, disabled right now because I don't need to run that again. I already have my invoices captured locally, so I don't need to make you watch that. I am going to go through and close this invoice that I had open though, because I don't want to cause any problems with me having it open versus the bot trying to read it. I don't need this notepad open anymore. All right, so let's run the bot. So while this is deploying and executing, a couple things that I think trip people up this week. One, like I said, adding those different line items and thinking through exactly how you do that. Two is adding that file and the way that you navigate through the file selector. I know that some people may have tried to cheat by doing that in JavaScript, but the reason I want you to learn how to use that open file selector is that process, the explore for file, comes up quite a bit in other real use cases that you'll see when you're building bots. So it's important to kind of understand how that one works and be comfortable using that, because you won't always be able to fake it with JavaScript. All right, so at this point, our bot should be going through and reading our invoice details from that CSV. It's going through and appropriately adding the different line items. Let's see the choose file thing here. Okay, it found our file name. It is typing a bit slower than I may like for entering the full file path. You could probably speed that up by switching to the simulate keystrokes and then minimizing the time between keystrokes. Here's our first invoice that has more than 3 rows, so that one worked. It looks like our logic there was pretty sound. We have 4 total line items that were added to this one. I would also say that notice that it didn't go in the exact order that we would expect. It did invoice 1 and then invoice 10, and now it's doing invoice 2, I think. And that's just because of, I think it's Unix file naming, where 1 is first, and then technically 1.0 would be second, and then 2 would be after that. So that's how it's going. For this exercise, it really doesn't matter. If you were crazy specific about the way that it had to go, you could probably set that up in a different way to loop through and figure out the proper ordering of your naming if you really were that specific. Or that would be an opportunity for a custom package where the package could return a list of all the files based on the modified date or based on the file name or whatever ordering you decided. So we'll continue to let this one run. I really hope you guys enjoyed the Bot Games Challenge. This was like a lot of planning went into this, a lot of content for a super small team, but this was an absolute blast to see the way that the Automation Anywhere community responded to this stuff. It looks like a lot of people had fun with this. It's been awesome to see stories of people learning new things and being able to apply that to real bots. So hopefully, you had some fun, but you're also building some confidence with your ability to automate processes and confidence around using the tool in general. So all of those are great things that came out of this. So it's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate everyone's participation. Let these last couple finish. So far, it looks like we're good. I don't think we've missed any. This is invoice 9. This is probably the last one. There we go. So we had a processing time of 151.47. That was probably not the fastest time you saw this week, but we got our accuracy. That's the most important thing. Now, the last thing I want to show you is some tips for the people who have maybe decided to do it on the upload server method. And I'm going to show you just a couple things here on what would be different if you were doing it that way. So if I went to my invoice challenge here, this is again just another sample bot, but if you wanted to actually upload yours to the IQBot server, this is the logic that I would do. It's just slightly different. First off, when you're processing your invoices, you need to loop through every single file within your folder, and you would upload those documents individually. So the IQBot upload document action would require you to do all of these individually. So you'd have to loop through all of those and upload them. Now, as you're uploading them, the IQBot server is processing them. It's not going to process them instantly, right? You're not going to give it one and it hands it back right away. It takes a couple seconds to process each of these. So what I did below that is add a loop where I'm trying to download all of the successful files that are available. And what I'm doing is I'm checking to see how many files do I have in my local directory? Do I have all 7 that I expected? If not, I'm going to set a couple second delay, and then I'll run that whole loop again. And I'm going to keep trying that until I have all of my 7 files downloaded locally, then I'll break. And at that point, I'm out of that loop. I'm not going to keep looping through that with a 5-second delay. And I did that so that I could hopefully, as efficiently as possible, make sure that I've downloaded all the files and have the result from the IQBot server. From there, most of the logic is the same, right? I'm reading the CSV, I'm entering my CSV details, I'm entering my tabular data. It all is the same until I get to my file upload. Now, when I get to my file upload, I need to select my file, which is fine, but then I have to actually find the name of the file that I need to upload. So we're using a regular expression here, and the first regular expression is going to find that invoice name, right, the name of my invoice, from within that greater string. If we go and look at an example of this, let me go back here. I think it was the invoice, sample invoices 5. This is an example, right? So I have this 36 character GUID dash invoice name dot tiff dot csv. So what I'm trying to do with this find in my string action is I'm trying to find, based on a regular expression, where I find something that matches this invoice name. When I find it, it's going to return to me a position and number, right, where it found that in the string. From there, I'm extracting a substring, and I'm saying, okay, whatever position you found that matching name, start from that point and extract to the end of the string, which in this case would be all the way to the end of tiff, right? I'm then saving that value to S file name, and I'm using that when we fill in the path to our open folder path thing, okay? So those are the only differences if you try to do it with the upload to IQBot server versus running locally. I just wanted to point that out, so if you want to try it the other way, you can, but either approach is valid. Thank you so much for hanging out for the entirety of this video. I appreciate you hanging with me on this entire solution. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you have a couple approaches to take away. Hopefully you're a little bit more comfortable with IQBot, learning some of these different actions, learning some of these different packages. Thanks so much for hanging out. Thanks for participating in bot games. My name is Micah Smith. Go be great.